So I visited a church that featured a Buddha, yin and yang, and a pentagram. So for those of you who don't know what a Unitarian Universalist church is, it's basically a church where you can find people from different backgrounds, and they believe that all spiritualities, all spiritual backgrounds have something to offer to spiritual empowerment, to revelation, and it's supposed to be inclusive, diverse, and open dialogue, basically. They don't necessarily push any sort of specific creed because they believe all religions should be at the table, being able to offer something to spiritual growth. So I attended a Unitarian Universalist church, and it was an interesting experience for me. It was my first time at a church like that, where all these different religions were being represented, where it was like supposed to be this whole very inclusive, open dialogue thing. And I actually attended two different services there in the same day, and I'm going to break down each of those and how they were, and show you some clips. But here's some clips of me walking up there and approaching the place before we even arrived. So as you can see, when we first arrived at the place, the first thing that people will notice is the fact that, one, it's at the city, it's in a city location, but also they had the rainbow flag, the Black Lives Matter flag, which is obviously an indicator that it's trying to be inclusive and also is more of the liberal bent in general. But after we walked inside, we ended up going upstairs into this little room with a bunch of older people. It was kind of interesting, actually, because when we first arrived, there was like no one really to greet us. It was kind of quiet and everything. We were like wondering where everyone was. It was like 8:30 in the morning. Me and my brother and a couple friends that came with me. So we were kind of curious where we had to go. But we wandered upstairs and we finally found the room that we were supposed to be at for our 8:30 session. That was supposed to be, according to what we saw online, open dialogue. We didn't know exactly what that meant, but we were going to check it out. So we walked into this room that looked like it was some sort of like preschool room. And I think that makes sense because it seems like they have preschoolers, kids that go there at least sometime during the day, as you can tell from the sign out front in the previous video. So we walked inside, and everyone was wearing masks except for us when we walked in. We weren't necessarily aware that we were supposed to bring masks, but everyone was wearing masks when we first walked in. And it was a bunch of old people, which I just thought was interesting because I expected to go in there. I expected to see a lot more diversity, but it was all old white people, which that just struck me as intriguing because I was expecting, again, a lot of just diversity and age range and stuff. I was actually even expecting, I think, somewhat of a younger audience to be there. But anyway, so just walked inside and we sat down and they got us chairs. They're very friendly. They greeted us and everything. We got 4 chairs for us, and then we sat in a circle, and everyone was sitting in a circle for the open dialogue session. Now, the open dialogue session, we were going through a specific book. And I'll pop the book up here on the screen. The Power Worshippers Inside a Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism by Catherine Stewart. So they were going through this book, and apparently they just started it because when we got there, they were just on like chapter 1 basically. And so apparently they were starting this whole new open dialogue based around this book. Like, I don't know how often a week they were meeting to talk. I'm assuming once a week. But they were opening up, they're talking about this book, and the rise of Christian nationalism was sort of the topic of the day. And soon enough, I could tell pretty well right away that almost everyone in there was a liberal or left leaning, and so everyone was kind of agreed upon the basic assumptions of the fundamentals of politics, but may have disagreed slightly on the particulars, which again just sort of intrigued me. One, for 2 reasons. Because we were talking about politics, and I expected to talk about spirituality. I expected to be talking about different religions, maybe some sort of gods or eternity or heaven, and people's different perspectives on it. And I was actually expecting to have like a talk about religion, but it was actually about politics, which I didn't really necessarily mind. I was just taken aback. And so pretty much everyone was talking about the dangers of the rise of Christian nationalism and how white supremacy is a big problem in the Western sphere. How they talked a lot about critical theory, critical race theory. There did happen to be one person who wasn't exactly among the majority, and there was only one person I could tell who outspokenly said he voted for Trump and outspokenly was Republican. I won't use the word conservative. He was at least Republican at one point, or is Republican still, one or the other. He was the only one that slightly dissented from the group. Overall, most people there sort of agreed on the core tenets. They all kind of agreed that Christian nationalism was one of America's biggest problems, they all kind of agreed that Christian nationalism is what led to the reign of Trump, as they would probably put it. They think that it was a source of a lot of the radicalism in America and a lot of problems in the West. And that was sort of what the discussion was about. And the discussion went on for about an hour. So me and my friends didn't really say much during this little meeting. They tried to pull us in a couple times. The one lady there said, "Hey, do you guys have anything to basically provide to the discussion?" And we opened up a little bit. We talked a little bit, but we didn't want to say much. We were there mostly to visit. We were there to see how things are run at the Unitarian Universalist church we were at and see what they're all about. So we didn't partake too much in the discussion, but that was what the core of the discussion was about. There was a ladder, so about the first, I would say 40 to 50 minutes was basically just about that topic and about that book. They would pull excerpts from it, and they would then use that to piggyback off to make more discussion and more commentary. And they would also were pulling out newspapers and news articles specifically relevant to the area. For instance, apparently there's this new documentary or patriotic documentary. I'm not entirely sure what it's about. I didn't look into it, but someone was passing an article around about this documentary that a theater in our area, in the area where I live, was not presenting because they didn't want to support the ideals that were in the documentary. And apparently it was some sort of, I think, conservative documentary. And there was sort of a discussion whether or not this is a good thing or a bad thing. Whether or not people on the left should be boycotting things on the right, like movies or documentaries. And there was sort of a discussion about that as well. But that was the center of the conversation for most of the time there. There was a point then later on where the New Testament or the Bible was brought in because, again, they were talking about Christian nationalism and the problem with Christian nationalism. And so they pulled in some things about the scriptures. And so there was this talk about how Paul corrupted the scriptures and how he made Christianity worse. They talked a little bit about sexism in the Bible. And there was also this conversation about Greek interpretation. And for instance, the one thing that they brought up was that the one guy there was studied Greek for at least 3 years, he said. I cannot verify that, but I'm assuming he did because everyone else seemed to agree that he knew Greek really well. But he claimed that the part in the Gospels where it talks about give unto Caesar what is Caesar's, because it bears the coin that the question was about, bared the image of Caesar, and there was a question of whether or not they should pay their taxes, and Jesus told them, give to Caesar what is Caesar's. Anyway, he uses that specific story to say that if you read it in the Greek, it's a clear indicator that there should be a separation of church and state. Then they talked a little bit about church history and sort of the violence behind church history and the problems with church history in general. The conversation, that was the only part where we really talked, I think, a lot about religion specifically, and it wasn't really strictly about politics or how religion influences politics. But yeah, so for about an hour, that was the opening discussion, was just about the dangers of right-wing conservatism, specifically Christian nationalism, and also the corruption of the Bible and how church history is kind of bad. And again, pretty much everyone agreed on the core tenets. Everyone's agreed that the Bible is sexist, that white supremacy is one of America's biggest problems, that Christian nationalism is one of the biggest problems. Except for that one guy, pretty much everyone agreed on the core tenets, and there wasn't much diversity in thought or opinion, just simply in tactics of how things should be fleshed out in practicality. So that was sort of the core of what happened during that hour-long session. But afterwards, we got into a little bit of discussion with some of the people there, and they were very friendly people, very nice. But I walked out of the room that we were in, waiting for the 10:30 a.m. session. We were going to attend the second one, and that was supposed to be a more traditional service. The opening thing was supposed to be open dialogue. But when I walked outside, I noticed the decorations inside the church, inside this Unitarian Universalist church, were a lot different than other churches I've been to in the past, from different denominations. And it was just intriguing. So here's a little shot of the lettering and the wording you'll see on the wall there. And this, if you can't really see it well, or you don't know what it says, here, I'll read it for you. So one of the top lines says, each and every one of us is a sacred uniqueness, and only in community do our differences grow and do we become fully ourselves. And there's a couple other texts around there, but that kind of gives you the general idea of the type of decorations you would see in this church. There was this idea that everyone's opinion is valuable, everyone's belief is valuable, and together as a community, we can grow stronger together if we all just, strive after the same thing, strive after, community and growth and these different beliefs. And so there's this whole idea of just, we don't need to push a certain creed. All we need is each other. That seemed to be kind of the mentality. That seemed to kind of be the mentality that was there that I could pick up. So again, there was sort of this strange weirdness to it that everyone seemed to be thinking the same way, although a lot of what the Declaration said is promotion of diverse thought. And I didn't see much diverse thought going on in the open discussion because everyone was agreeing and was of the same political bent except for one person, which isn't that much diversity in thought. So that just kind of threw me off for a loop. I was kind of confused by that, but I thought maybe entering to the service, I was just see how that goes. We went downstairs, and I got into a nice conversation with the lady there, and she told me a little bit about the history of the church. It's a very lovely sanctuary there, and I'll get into that a little bit later. We didn't actually have service in their traditional sanctuary, which was over like 100 years old. We had service down in the basement, and I don't know exactly what the reason was. I can't remember for sure. But there was a certain reason why they weren't using the sanctuary during the summer months here. So we went downstairs and we headed into the room there. And now, the room that we entered in, both these rooms, there was nothing special about them. They almost reminded me of like what you would expect at some sort of like school, elementary school, kind of like those type of rooms. So we walked inside and there was just these chairs set up at like half circle. And at this point, we had to put on masks. We had to put on masks for the service upon request. So we did. We put on masks. We went inside. And we sat there and we waited for a little bit. A lady came up and then introduced the guest speaker for the day. And the guest speaker, I don't remember her name, but she had some sort of major. I think it was in psychology or something like that. But she was invited on stage and she was going to be giving a little discussion on grief. And she was going to be talking about grief and loss. And that was supposed to be the theme of the service. Traditionally, from other churches I've been to in the past, I kind of expected some sort of sermon. In this case, since I knew it was more of a, Unitarian Universalists are a little bit more liberal and they don't necessarily promote a certain creed, I thought it might be like a TED Talk or something. I didn't know exactly what to expect, but I was thinking maybe something more academic in nature. But it was actually much more mystical than I expected it to be. So it started off with a couple opening questions. So the lady asked 2 questions specifically and gave us, for each of them, 8 minutes to discuss them with someone else in the room. She asked us to talk to someone we didn't really know that well. I ended up just talking to one of the guys I came with, but that's how it worked out. The first question was something about how does loss or grief make you feel? I forget exactly what the first question was, but I do remember the second question was, who or what do you go to find consolation when in grief? It was something along those lines, like who or what do you find peace in, or do you go to find comfort? Me and my brother discussed the question a little bit, and we talked about kind of our experience up to this point during that time. And there was just everyone around the room was just sort of talking about this question, who or what they find comfort in. And this was about the first 20 minutes of the service, these opening 2 questions, along with a little introduction of who the lady was and what she was there for and her purpose. And so after those opening questions, we were called back to our seats and we sat back down. And then we proceeded to do some sort of meditation. And now the meditation was intriguing. So it was like a breathing exercise, which I've done breathing exercises before for a variety of reasons. And so I expected this to be like some sort of slow, methodical, in and out sort of practice, but it was actually a lot more upbeat than I expected the music was. And it was like, kind of had like this African vibe to it. And it was kind of upbeat. And it did have like these breathe in, breathe out, find peace and harmony words to it. But it was just not as slow and methodical as I thought it would be. It wasn't as peaceful. It actually kind of felt a little bit like I need to go run or something. So it felt a little bit more upbeat than expected. But we were supposed to plant our feet into the ground, kind of like close our eyes, take some deep breaths with the music, and meditate and find peace. I think, and it was about kind of like finding and being aware of your surroundings. So there was a lot of these expressions during the service about being aware of your surroundings, being in the moment, and taking in what you're experiencing, and being aware of how you're feeling and what's going on. It was all about awareness and being of the moment and being aware of your experience. And that was what you were supposed to do during this meditation. You're supposed to be aware of all the breath coming in and out, and be aware of where you're at and everything around you, there was sometimes we were called to look around and look at each other and notice one another. And it was just supposed to be this very like almost like mystical experience. It felt like it was supposed to be. At least that's what it seemed like she was going for. But after following these opening questions and the meditation, it led into some sort of self-expression practice. So there was this idea of, okay, loss is a part of life, grief is a part of life. And so the lady who was leading the service plucked a bunch of dead plants from her garden, from her flower beds and garden and stuff. She took a bunch of dead flowers and stuff, and then she put them on a table around a little candle. And here, I'll show you a little picture of what I'm talking about. So she took a bunch of dead flowers and plants, put them around a table, and we were supposed to take these. She gave us about 10 minutes to take some of these dead flowers and plants and make some sort of art form out of it, make some sort of picture or art or display that's supposed to represent how we're feeling and to express what grief means to us and what loss means to us. And we're just supposed to express ourselves and, being aware of our moment, being aware of who we are. And that was what we did for the next 10 minutes was just, and there was music playing in the background. People were talking with one another as well a little bit. I got into a discussion with the lady filming the whole service because I noticed that she was filming, and I do filming, obviously. And so we got into a little discussion about videography and marketing and different things like that. Anyway, that's a side note. But so we were supposed to make these creations, and then following that, we were all asked to walk around in silence for a few minutes and take in our surroundings and take in what everyone made, and just think to yourself what it means to you and what do you think the person was trying to get across and what feelings it evokes, and be aware of your moment. It was all about being aware of your moment and your time there and your experiences and your surroundings and being aware of what you're feeling. And so we're supposed to walk around in silence, and that's what we did for the next few minutes was walk around in silence, observing what everyone made out of their little flower creations. And then following that, we were all called back to our chairs. We sat down, and there was a little bit of an outro, like a benediction to close the service. And I also remember she read a poem. I think it was in the beginning of the service, though. So she read a poem about loss and grief. But yeah, so after the benediction, that was the closing. That was all there was. There wasn't really a sermon. There wasn't really prayer. I know that we talked to someone there, and they did say that we did come to a service that's a little bit different. They often do have people who go up there and teach, or it's more exhortation oriented or teaching oriented. But the one we went to was a little bit more meditation, a little bit more mystical, a little bit more that way. So yeah, that was the service at the Unitarian Universalist Church. After we left, we went upstairs, and there was this old building attached to the newer building of this church. So the church itself was about over 100 years old. I forget when it was made. It was like early 1900s, but it was over 100 years old. We were in the newer part of the building that was made in like the 70s or something like that. But the original church was old, and the sanctuary was right there. And my brother and I, we were interested in seeing it. And there was a guy there, and he said, "Yeah, you want a tour of the place?" And I was like, "Sure." So we got a tour of their actual sanctuary, and they do use it still. They just didn't use it that day. I forget again why. But here, I'll show you what it looks like. It's a very lovely sanctuary, very beautiful building. It has stained glass windows. It almost has like this Orthodox look to it, this Orthodox feel to it, and how it's structured and how it's portrayed. But what is unique about it is, unlike a traditional Orthodox church, it has a lot of different religious symbols going on. So as you will notice in this one shot, there's a Buddha up on a shelf, just kind of sitting there meditating and overlooking like these yoga mats. And I think that's where like women would go for, I don't know exactly what they would do there, but it seemed like it was oriented for women. There was also women like, I don't know if saints is the word I would use, but I guess for the lack of a better term, women saints who were either great achievers in science, great achievers at mathematics. There were religious symbols like Mary. There were religious women like Mary. So there were a bunch of like memorials basically for women, representing women who accomplished a lot. Even in the stained glass, there were historical names that weren't necessarily biblical in nature, but they're just people who had great achievements. And so the building had a very Orthodox look to it, but with a lot of different religious symbols. And at the front, here's another clip, that at the front you can see that there's a, I'm not sure what you would call it, maybe like a wind chime type thing, but an ornament nonetheless, hanging from the ceiling of the sanctuary. And it has a bunch of different religious symbols on it. So at the bottom you'll see that there's like Islam with the moon and the star, and you see where there's Christianity with the cross and then a Star of David. And there's just Hinduism and these different religions represented. And at the top, you'll see a pentagram. And so there's just these different religions represented on this thing to, I guess, create a inclusive and welcoming atmosphere. And there's also different ornamentation like this throughout the building itself. I mean, here's an example of a painting that I saw in the main lobby when we walked in. So this type of decoration was everywhere. You had these wordings of inclusivity, like the sentence I showed you earlier, and just these paintings and different religious symbols going on. But yeah, that was the sanctuary, and it was really, really beautiful, really, really cool sanctuary. And the guy was very nice who showed it to us, and he gave us a little bit of history and a background on how Unitarians and Universalists were once a separate church, but then they came together because they had sort of a common goal. And so he kind of told us the history of the church and the history of the place and the inspiration behind some things. But it was a very lovely sanctuary, very lovely place. And then we ended up leaving after that tour, and we went to Mission Barbecue to eat lunch. But it was a great time. It was an interesting time. It was much different than any other church service I've been to, but that is kind of what you can expect to see at a Unitarian Universalist church, at least the one I went to. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed learning about the Unitarian Universalist Church, I go visit other religious buildings. I visited a temple, Kingdom Hall in the past, and I'm going to be visiting more religious buildings in different religions and different places. I'm thinking about going to see a Quaker meeting hall and telling you about my experience there. So if this type of thing intrigues you, if you like seeing other religious buildings, you kind of like learning about other religions, definitely subscribe, leave a like, and leave a comment below of what you enjoyed, or what religion you're a part of, or what place I should visit next. So thank you for joining me, thank you for being with me, and go out there, friends, and continue to light the world.